Welcome. This is our second introductory video. In it, I explore why Genesis 3 is not a Christian blueprint. Genesis 3 is one of the most quoted chapters in Christian discussions about men and women. And yet, it is one of the most misunderstood, not because people don't know what it says, but because they quietly assume it tells us how things are supposed to be. It doesn't. Genesis 3 does not give a blueprint. It gives a diagnosis. That distinction matters more than most people realize. In Genesis 1 and 2, we are shown creation as God gives it. Life is received, not seized. Relationship is ordered, but not competitive. Difference exists without domination. Direction exists without control. Genesis 2 is not naive. It is not an unrealistic, fragile ideal that only works in a world without moral complexity. Rather, the world, and specifically its people, are deliberately ordered by gift, by giving and receiving, not by power. Genesis 3 introduces something entirely new, totally different, and horrific. The man and the woman turn from receiving life from God to securing life for themselves. And once that happens, relational life changes shape. God does not respond by issuing commands. He describes consequences. To the woman, God says, "Your desire will be toward or against your husband, and he will rule over you." This is not instruction. It is exposure. God is naming what sin will now do to relationships. And the distortions follow a clear pattern. Desire becomes rivalry. Self-giving becomes domination. Difference becomes threat. Order becomes power struggle. Genesis 3 tells us what happens when relational trust collapses. But here is the crucial mistake. Much Christian theology quietly treats Genesis 3 as normative. It treats these distortions as the world we must now work within, rather than the world Christ has come to redeem. And this is where the familiar divide emerges. Hierarchical complementarianism begins by accepting domination as the given condition of fallen relationships, and then asks how Christian order can be maintained within that condition. Egalitarianism begins by accepting power struggle as the given condition of fallen relationships, and then asks how Christian life can escape or overcome it. Both approaches assume the same starting point. Genesis 3 is treated as the operating horizon. The disagreement then becomes not about whether the fall governs relationships, but about how best to manage its effects. One approach tries to constrain domination. The other tries to dissolve power. But both are managing the fall. But Paul does something very different. Paul does not begin with Genesis 3. He begins with Genesis 2, and then runs that logic through Christ. When Paul quotes Genesis, he overwhelmingly quotes Genesis 1 and 2, not Genesis 3. When he speaks about marriage, he does not say, "Because of sin, someone must rule." Instead, he says, "As Christ loved the church and gave himself." That is not Genesis 3 reasoning. That is Genesis 2 order restored through Christ. Paul is not interested in managing rivalry. He is interested in restoring relational visibility. That is why Paul resists power language. That is why he is careful with submission. That is why he speaks in terms of love, reverence, honor, and glory. These are creation and redemption categories, not fall management categories. Genesis 3 explains the problem, but it does not define the solution. Paul does not try to fix the curse. He proclaims the cross. Christ does not manage Genesis 3. He absorbs it and reopens Genesis 2. So here's the key point. If your theology of men and women begins with Genesis 3, it will always sound defensive, urgent, and fragile. If it begins with Genesis 2 and runs through Christ, it will sound unfamiliar, but it will be coherent. Genesis 3 diagnoses what went wrong. It does not tell us how redeemed life should be ordered. In the next video, we'll look at why hierarchy is not the same thing as order, and why confusing the two has distorted Christian theology far more than most people realize.